In this video, I'm going to be talking about communication, and I'm going to be focusing on one specific type of communication issue in autistic people and what helps them. To place this into context, first let's remember that autism is an umbrella term for a specific cluster of neurodevelopmental endophenotypes. That means that autistic people are different, and even though something like communication issues may affect many, there are different obstacles. One of the things that I think that we should really be somewhat less concerned about is this notion of autism as a social communication disorder. Let's just say why. If you're not autistic, it may look like that because you struggle to understand autistic people. That brings us to what we call the double empathy problem. There are autistic scientists who've written about this quite a bit. Autistic people among themselves, and especially if their autism is similar, they understand each other okay. They don't have a social communication problem so much. It's the non-autistic people who don't understand them. And then also the autistic people don't understand the non-autistic people so well. They think they're like illogical and they talk in such weird ways and whatever. So that's, it's not necessarily that we have a social communication disorder. You do not have to try to change autistic people in that respect. You need to respect that the communication styles are different and we can learn from each other both ways. Sorry if I lump all non-autistic people into one big agglomeration. Neurodiversity is a thing. There are many different people other than autistic people as well. It's not just this and that. Okay, but let's put that aside for a moment. There are some problems with producing speech. Speech is not the ideal form of communication for many, and perhaps I would even say for most autistic people. Sometimes it's expedient, just as for non-autistic people, you will use many modes of communication. DJ Savares has actually spoken about this as well, an autistic non-speaker, about how he uses, sometimes he will use this kind of device, sometimes he needs that kind of support, sometimes he uses sign language. So in the same way for autistic people, we don't need just one kind of communication device, and that's what you get because you're not speaking. You may need many over time, but it depends on what the issues are, and if those things are better understood, then we can see how those supports need to be given. I, as a fairly fluently speaking autistic person, I think you would say that I speak okay. I have lost speech as well, and it usually goes, first of all, in my eye contact, next in my tone, and I struggle to modulate my tone. Eventually everything comes through staccato, and then the words go away completely. From then on, I can usually still write. When I can't write anymore, then I can usually still do maybe one word text, and then eventually it falls apart. Can't do that as well. So even speaking autistics can lose speech. I have not lost speech for quite a long time, thank goodness. But at the end of the day, some of us will not answer our phones, and some of us never answer phones anyway. We can't do that kind of conversation. But yeah, however, let's move now to some of the movement disorders, which can be obstacles. And this is very, very underdiagnosed or misunderstood or not recognized in autistic people. There are some speech and language therapists who will recognize apraxia of speech or childhood apraxia of speech, where somebody is trying to produce the speech sound, but they have difficulty in moving their mouth, their tongue, the many complex parts that go into, and also getting the sound out of here, the many complex parts that go into producing speech. And so people try to focus on that. It's a complete fallacy to think that someone needs to be able to speak before they can read and write, and therefore things like writing or reading and word-based communication in other forms is often withheld unjustly from autistic people because this is not understood, that it's not going to stop you from speaking. In some cases, it's actually going to ease the frustration, and then once you have something where, thank goodness, I can now communicate in some form, now I can take my energy and I can actually put it into something like speech and see whether I can do that too. But please don't start with forcing speech if that is the most difficult area that someone has. Give them some other means to get them going. For some people, that other means might be what they continue using as their primary mode of communication for the rest of their lives. And for others, it might be a bridge to something else or something to augment something. I, as a speaking autistic, and I was hyperlexic, I learned to speak very young. I also learned to read and write very young. I wrote my first book before I went to school. I started learning to read before I was 2 years old. So, autism is an umbrella term, right? Even I and friends like me say we wish that we had had the benefit of learning sign language, because there are times when we do not speak very well, where amongst ourselves we would love to be able to use something like that. The downside of South African Sign Language is that it uses very animated facial expressions, and that is exactly what we don't want to do when we're tired. That would be easier. So in fact, I have one friend who uses finger spelling because she loses speech just like very quickly, and then she goes over into finger spelling, and her face is very bland. Okay, so that's as a little bit of a background to many of us have problems, and speech is not really ideal. So I would like to zoom in on a particular area though, a movement disorder which is usually not diagnosed, which is now appearing to be, and this is anecdotal, and I'm taking it from the experiences of non-speaking autistic writers, as well as from the experiences of speech and language therapists who work with this population, who recognize the disorder, that the major obstacle to many autistic people not being able to speak, regardless of the etiology of their autism, because they may have ended up in that state through various different internal means, is a form of apraxia, and for lack of a better term, I refer to it as autistic apraxia, although the same kind of phenomenon does also occur, it seems, in some non-autistic people. Let's identify what that type of apraxia is about. And perhaps we should first take a look at dyspraxia so that before we get to apraxia. So in dyspraxia, I am mildly dyspraxic, so I'm slightly clumsy. I don't plan very well. I need to have complex mechanisms to do things like stay tidy, to stay focused on things. My hand-eye coordination wasn't always that great. It took a bit of practice. Ballet helped me, but some of my friends are more clumsy than I am, and are more visibly kind of they look odd and disoriented, and they walk like this and so on. So the dyspraxia may be a bit worse than mine. Apraxia is the extreme form of all of that. So a regular apraxic, the way that we understand it, would be somebody who perhaps wants to, I'm going to point here and I now want to touch the screen, but my hand, I can't direct it properly and it goes slightly skew, and I'm struggling to roll my hand back into that position. That's what a lot of apraxia is, the way that we understand it. And then there will be other things as well, impulse control, which is difficult. What's specific about many autistic people and their apraxia is a weird thing. Namely, not that it's about accuracy about movement, but when you try to do that, you do a different thing altogether. When you try to say yes, you say no. When you try to point, or you're asked to point to the green, you instead point to the blue. Two completely different things. That creates the impression that many autistic people are cognitively impaired. So let's use old names for that. Cognitively impaired, brain damaged, retarded. That's the kind of terminology people used to use for this. You're stupid. Well, some of us do have brain injuries. Some people are cognitively impaired. Some people do have intellectual disabilities. Some people have folate deficiency in childhood, which causes permanent damage to the brain. That does happen, but that does not seem to be the major and the majority state for autistic people. What is a lot more common is this type of autistic apraxia, which non-speakers who can communicate in words because they've been given the means to do so refer to as the body-mind disconnect, or the brain body disconnect, terms like that. That's what they use. They describe how it's like they know exactly what they want to do, or even what they want to say for those who speak, but it's a different word that pops out, or it's a different movement that comes out. And some impulses are absolutely irresistible for them. An example, which I have from one speech and language therapist in the USA, they had a regular client who, when he arrived at their center for his therapy sessions, and if there was music playing in the reception room, then and a specific song played, then he would start jumping very excitedly and smiling. So they assumed he liked the song. When he eventually got to the point of being able to communicate what he wanted to communicate by pointing to a letterboard, after a lot of training to help him to coordinate his body, he had a very specific request. Please do not play that song ever when I have an appointment, because my body cannot help but react to it, and then I cannot stop my body. So in the same way, somebody gets offered a bowl of food, and there's something for everybody, and you're supposed to help yourself, and this person grabs the lot, and then they stuff themselves, and then they think that this person must be daft and doesn't know of better, has no manners, doesn't understand social skills. That's not the problem. The problem is that your body has a mind of its own. So this is vital to understand if we are working in an area of communication support for autistic people. We have to understand that this is common. And we can say that it is common because people who have been experts at communication therapy, who have worked in multiple modes of AAC, which is augmentative and assistive communication. I hope I got that right. I always get those words mixed up. And then who have worked with an understanding that there is competence there, but it needs to be brought out through better training of motor skills. Once they start seeing it that way and they start working with good methods on the motor skills, they find that the majority of the clients that they used to have on things like picture card systems, PCS, that they used to have on sign language, and the person couldn't do the signs very well, that they had on reduced sign language systems like Makaton, which just gives you some very, I almost say like baby-like vocabulary. It's not terribly extensive. You cannot write an academic essay in Makaton. When they have discovered that the motor skills are the problem, all of these other systems were the wrong things for those people. They should not even have been a first step towards that in some cases, because those people had such a problem with motor skills. It doesn't help to give them, a pad which has got a couple of little pictures on which they can now press and they can type on, because they cannot move to the one which they mean anyway. And the reduced vocabulary does not allow you to say, if you ask somebody, which is it? I can't understand what you're trying to say to me. Is it food or is it toilet? Imagine you get given that choice, and it's neither of those. Or within the food category, it is, yes, it is food, but please do not give me bread again, because the last time it gave me a tummy ache. But you don't get given that choice. You just get food or toilet. So it really is of key importance for those people who can handle it, that we develop the motor skills so that they develop nuanced communication. So now, where do we get information about, from people who say what this is like? There are many autistic people who write about what this is like. But for some ableist reason, the people who work with guys like them are not reading this stuff. They're going to study under blah, blah, blah expert who's not autistic, who does not experience this problem, who doesn't know what it's like, who doesn't know what it's like. Writing by people like Ido Kedar, for example, is usually my favorite example, but there are so many others. Ido's story is exasperating in the sense that he was a non-speaking guy. He went through all the traditional therapies, like behavior therapy for a movement disorder. Come on, so 8 hours a day. Point to this, point to that, high five, this kind of baby stuff. And then he can't do it because his body doesn't want to do the stuff. So he went through learning to point to a letterboard in a supported way, where somebody had to say to him, no, wait, up with your hand, wait, let's try that again, and direct his hand to the point where he could do this on his own, and where somebody's just holding the letterboard. But still, people don't want to believe that it's him doing it. So he actually said, I want to be able to learn to completely independently communicate, because nobody is believing that this is me. And so he learned to communicate independently. He types independently on a keyboard. Still, somehow people seem to think that someone is beaming thoughts into his head via the keyboard or whatever. So what do you have to do to be believed? What do you have to do as a non-speaking person to be allowed to have the kind of therapy that will help you to control your body so you can communicate independent thoughts? This is a human rights issue. This is a serious human rights issue, which I'll get back to in a later video. But let's first of all now talk about some of those people and the kind of support which people need with motor issues. In some cases, it's not so severe. So I've come across autistic children who can write, sometimes in quite large scrawl, but sometimes actually pretty neatly as well. So their apraxia is not that bad. They can't do it so much with the mouth. They still have the impulse control problems, but they can do writing. So that's pretty cool. For others, it's a lot more severe than that. They struggle to stay or to keep their body on task. And you need to have somebody who's holding a letterboard where they can actually even follow the person around in the initial stages, because the person's body is going there. So you need to put the letterboard there. Oh, wait, you're in this part of the room now. So, okay, let's do this. Until they learn to do that better. And for some people, it's always going to be kind of hard and they're going to need a bit more support. For others, they're going to get to the kind of stage that Ido Kadar is. And I've seen some people now who are really, really proficient who are using this to develop their speech. At the same time as this is happening, at the same time as they're communicating proficiently, often, on a letterboard, there might be stuff coming out of their mouth which is irrelevant. And so I know a couple of kids where that happens. Well, things being shouted, whatever, you just got to ignore that. In fact, they will tell you, please ignore what comes out of my mouth. That's not really under my control. But look at these words. And so then they write blogs, they write books. I'm currently working on creating a blog for non-speaking autistic South Africans so that they can get their words out there. What are some of those words which come out? Well, please go and read some of these things. What are non-speaking autistic writers writing about? I have an entire list of them. I'm sharing them practically every single day. Some of the main themes that come out there is, please help other people like me. Please don't leave us stuck with no means of communication, no means of nuanced communication. Don't just give us this, this card or that card. The other message which is coming out there, and this comes out with tears sometimes, it comes out with exasperation. There's post-traumatic trauma around this particular thing. And that is autistic people being treated like babies and being treated as if they're stupid. We shouldn't even be treating a person who has an intellectual disability with disrespect. And yet, people who simply have a problem with their movement and with their impulse control get talked to as if they're young children. It's one of the biggest, most frustrating things for them. We have parents who find it, once they discover that this is what they should not be doing, then they try really hard to not do it. But years and years of not saying, hello, my boy, when the guy is like 19 years old, okay? It's just kind of hard to learn to not do that habit. For me, if I walk into the presence of a non-speaker who has no reliable means of communication and who doesn't have any motor means, then I will usually just talk to them like an ordinary person, and I'll just kind of let them know that I know. So I'll say, hi, my name is Tanya, I'm also autistic. My autism is different from yours. I understand that you can't speak. I understand that you understand everything that we're talking about. So if your mom starts talking to me about you, then I know you're listening, and so I'm not going to be part of her gossip in front of you. I'll recognize your presence. So, this is what we're going to do. He's another human being. Good grief. Okay. And I'm not even somebody who's particularly perceptive about what somebody else might be thinking or feeling. So, I need to take extra precautions that I'm treating somebody just like, at least like my equal. Those are some of the things we need to focus on. So if we're going to take a path forward with non-speakers who have this particular issue, and that can be identified by people who can be trained to identify this. Is apraxia the actual problem? Is this what it is? There are some speech and language therapists who specialize in this. It is a specialist field, and it is something that requires some training. And the reason for that is that if you just say, oh, whoa, letterboards, I'm going to try this with my client, what we often see is people who don't know what they're doing. They've come perhaps from an ABA background. They over and over prompt that person, no, do it this way, do it that way. Yeah, good boy. Ooh, and then eventually that person hates this because it's frustrating, and they develop trauma around this, and then they don't want to go near a letterboard. So that's why we need to have people who know what they're doing, who are expert at this, who's not going to traumatize the client, who understands this very well, who has worked with people who have worked with other non-speakers, who are regularly reading what non-speakers say, for goodness sake. Okay. To help that. What can we do if we don't know those techniques, though, to make things better? Well, one of the things that does help is, and why this technique, or the techniques, it's not just one, the methods which deal with this particular obstacle, what they have in common is they recognize that people don't have the fine motor skills to do the writing, and we have to move everything over into gross motor first, before we can move back into fine motor. And to get good gross motor control, it also actually works better. I'm just thinking offhand, an autistic friend who was a teacher who used to find that it was easier to use things like flip charts and get kids to go with large pens and write on them than to get them to sit at a desk and write if they had these kinds of issues. But so what do we need to do? Well, one of the things is to get the kind of coordination that crosses the midline. Okay, we know this concept in ballet. You don't, in some movements, you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to, in certain ballet methods, see that there's an imaginary line here. So here, in this kind of approach to learn better motor skills, if you have autistic apraxia, you are trying to cross the midline. Somebody might hold 2 punch bags, for example, or 2 tambourines and get you to go boof, 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 boof. Any exercises, and with legs as well, that get you to cross the midline. So that makes occupational therapy, physiotherapy, people like that can be very important in supporting those processes towards communication as well.